She always left around the same time, 6:45 p.m., books tucked under one arm, a coffee thermos in the other. "I just need some quiet," Maya would say, brushing her lips across Derek's cheek like it was a ritual she didn't want to think too hard about. She'd smile, say she'd be home by 10, and disappear out the door with her hair tied back and determination in her stride. For the first few weeks, Derek didn't question it. Maya had always been driven. The idea of her going back to school in her mid-30s had filled him with pride. She said it was for advancement, a shot at a promotion. He believed her. At first, he was supportive. She'd find him in the kitchen after work, stirring her favorite soup, asking about her classes. But her answers were vague. She spoke of study sessions and academic pressure, of professors who were tough graders, and group projects that dragged on endlessly. Still, something was off. Her notebooks were always pristine, as if they'd never been opened. She never brought up classmates by name, never vented about the usual chaos of school life. And the grades, well, they weren't getting any better. In fact, they hadn't changed at all. No A's, no breakthroughs, just silence. Derek tried to push the doubt aside. He told himself it was the stress, or maybe Maya didn't want to bring school tension into their marriage. But cracks had started to form. Tiny fractures that appeared in offhand remarks and missed dinners. She was quieter at home, distant. He'd find her scrolling her phone late at night, screen tilted away. When he asked what she was reading, she'd mumble, "Just coursework," and quickly lock it. Then came the missed anniversaries, the sudden excuses for why she couldn't make their weekend plans. One evening, when he offered to pick her up from the library, she panicked. "Don't," she said too quickly. "I take breaks. I walk around, go to a café. You won't find me in one spot." The way she said it, disjointed, defensive, stuck with him. By week 5, the gnawing unease had grown into something he couldn't swallow. He wasn't paranoid, he was observant. Derek had built his career in architecture on attention to detail. He noticed the subtle shifts in light, the way shadows bent against imperfect corners. Now those instincts were telling him something about Maya didn't align. He started keeping track. Times she left, when she got home, how often she studied. The pieces didn't fit. Her timelines were fuzzy. Once she claimed to be at the university library, but the library's website showed it had closed early that evening for maintenance. He didn't confront her, not yet, but he started preparing for what he didn't want to find. The truth had a smell, and Derek could feel it in the air. Like rain before the storm. It was a rainy Thursday when Derek decided he couldn't sit in the dark anymore. He'd had enough of pretending everything was fine, enough of the hollow reassurances and the half-kisses that tasted more like obligation than love. He hadn't told Maya he'd be leaving work early that day. Instead, he slipped out of the office just after lunch, his mind already calculating the distance between her supposed study spot and every cafe within walking range. He waited at home, watching the clock like a man preparing for surgery, knowing the incision would hurt, but also knowing it had to be done. At 6:38 p.m., Maya appeared in the hallway mirror, adjusting her scarf and smoothing down the cover of her worn psychology textbook. She offered a soft smile, the kind she used to give without thinking. Now it felt rehearsed. "Don't wait up," she said casually. Derek just nodded. 5 minutes later, he grabbed his keys and followed her. Derek didn't tail her like in the movies. No sunglasses, no hiding behind parked cars. He simply drove far enough behind that she wouldn't notice him. Maya walked confidently, no hesitation in her steps, turning corners with familiarity. After 15 minutes, she slipped into a small, dim cafe tucked between an antique bookstore and a nail salon, nowhere near the university library. He parked across the street, engine off, rain tapping on his windshield in rhythmic betrayal. From where he sat, he had a clear view of the front windows of the cafe. It wasn't a study-friendly place. Too cozy, too intimate, with low lighting and jazz humming through the speakers inside. No one studied here. Maya slid into a booth near the back, setting her books aside like props in a school play. A few minutes later, a man walked in. He was tall, lean, dressed in that kind of effortless confidence that suggested he never had to try hard for anything. Derek knew instantly this wasn't a professor, or a study partner, or a stranger offering help with flashcards. The man greeted Maya with a smile that felt too familiar, too practiced. Then, without ceremony, he sat beside her, not across from her, and draped an arm over her shoulder as if that space had always belonged to him. Maya didn't flinch. She didn't push him away. She leaned in, laughing softly at something he said, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing circles on the rim of her coffee mug. Derek felt like the air had been vacuumed out of his car. He sat frozen, heart hammering, but not with rage, at least not yet. First came disbelief, like his brain needed time to accept what his eyes already knew. Then a cold wave of clarity swept over him. Everything lined up now. The sudden shift in affection, the late nights, the empty excuses, the manufactured stress over non-existent exams. This wasn't about school. It never had been. She was failing all right, but not the kind of test that involved pencils or textbooks. She was failing the one that actually mattered. Derek watched for 15 minutes, long enough to see Maya touch the man's knee under the table, long enough to see her tilt her head into his shoulder like she belonged there. That hurt more than anything else. Not the deception, but the ease with which she gave herself to someone else. There was no guilt on her face, no hesitation. It was as if Derek no longer existed in her emotional orbit. Eventually, he started the car and drove away, not because he couldn't bear to see more, but because he had seen enough. He didn't cry on the drive home. Derek was not a man who cried easily, but his hands trembled on the steering wheel, and when he pulled into the garage, he sat in silence for 10 minutes just staring at the dashboard. He wanted to scream, to punch the steering wheel, to break something, but he didn't. Instead, he cataloged the facts, stored the images in his memory like evidence in a courtroom. There would be a reckoning, but it wouldn't be in anger. It would be in truth. When Maya walked through the door that night, she looked exactly as she had when she left. Same books in hand, same damp scarf around her neck. But to Derek, everything about her now looked artificial, and he was done pretending. The house was quiet when Maya came home. Rain still clung to her coat, giving her the look of someone who'd come from a long, grueling study session. She dropped her keys into the bowl by the front door, like always, and set her books on the console table. Another ritual performed with practiced normalcy. From the living room, Derek watched her silently. He hadn't turned on the TV or any music. He wanted her to feel the stillness he had been living in for weeks. He wanted the silence to say what words couldn't. "Hey!" she called softly when she saw him on the couch, her voice breezy, almost too light. "You still up?" She walked in, removing her scarf, wringing out the edge of it. "I thought you'd be asleep by now." Derek didn't respond at first. He simply studied her. The way she moved, the way she avoided direct eye contact as she fiddled with her wet scarf, the faint perfume on her coat. Vanilla and citrus, not the scent she wore when they met, not the one he had always associated with her. It was newer, bolder, and now it smelled like someone else. "I was waiting," he said eventually, voice low and even. "Thought we could talk." Maya gave him a cautious smile. "Sure, everything okay?" That question, the gall of it, nearly undid him, but he kept his composure. "Sit down," he said, motioning to the armchair across from him. He didn't want her beside him, not tonight. That space, like so many others in their life together, no longer belonged to her. She hesitated for a second before obeying, sensing that the air had shifted. Derek looked at her, really looked. "Maya," he began slowly, "do you remember when we used to talk about everything, not just plans or bills or weekend chores, but real things? The way we used to sit at the kitchen counter and share every ridiculous thought we had? The way we used to be honest, even when it hurt?" She blinked, uncertain. "Yeah, of course. I mean, life gets busy, but—" "No," he interrupted gently. "Don't deflect. Not this time." She grew still. "I followed you tonight," he said, watching her face. Her expression didn't change immediately, but her posture did. Her shoulders stiffened, her jaw tightened ever so slightly. "You what?" "I followed you. I wanted to see where you were studying, who you were with. You've been disappearing into the night for weeks, and every time I asked, you gave me just enough to silence my instincts, but never enough to satisfy them." Maya swallowed, eyes darting away from his. "You didn't trust me?" "I did," he said quietly. That's the tragedy, Maya. I trusted you far longer than you deserved." Her lips parted, maybe to object, maybe to defend herself. But Derek raised his hand. "I saw you," he continued, "in that café, with him. The guy with the leather jacket and the easy laugh. I saw his arm around you. I saw you lean into him like he was home. And I stayed just long enough to know this wasn't a misunderstanding." Maya's mouth went dry. "Derek, it's not what it looked like." He laughed softly, bitterly. "Please, don't insult me. That line might work on someone else, but not me. I saw enough to know you weren't thinking about midterms or flashcards. You weren't reviewing case studies. You were living a lie, a very well-rehearsed one." Her face twisted in desperation. "It wasn't serious. It's not an affair." "No," he said, his voice sharper now. "Then what is it? A mentorship? A comforting hug after a particularly hard paragraph?" She flinched. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Derek nodded slowly, like he was cataloging her every word. "That's the line people always use when they cross a boundary they swore they'd never even approach. I didn't mean for it to happen. As if it's some external force. As if you just tripped and fell into someone else's arms." "I was overwhelmed," she whispered. "The pressure, the school, the house, everything. I felt lost." "So you found yourself in someone else?" he said flatly. Tears welled in her eyes, but Derek didn't move. He didn't soften. He'd cried for her already, in silence, in doubt, in disbelief. Now, there was only the clarity of truth. "I don't love him," she said, voice cracking. "It's not love. It was just attention. I felt seen." Derek stood, the weight of her words pressing him to his feet like gravity itself had turned against him. "You were always seen, Maya. I've been right here, applauding every ambition, cheering every step forward, carrying more than my share so you could have room to breathe. Don't tell me this happened because I didn't see you." She opened her mouth, but there were no words. He looked down at her one last time, something between pity and finality in his gaze. "You had one test to pass. One. And it wasn't in a classroom. It was here. With me." Then he walked past her, through the same front door she'd used as an escape route for weeks. And this time, he was the one who didn't look back. The morning after the confrontation, the house felt colder, not because of the weather, but because something essential had left with Derek when he walked out that door. Maya woke up to silence. No smell of coffee, no soft hum of the news playing in the background, just the eerie stillness of a home no longer shared. His side of the bed was untouched, the sheets smooth, the air around it distant. She stared at it, half hoping he would walk in and say something, angry, loving, anything, but all she heard was the ticking of the hallway clock, each second pulling her further into the weight of consequence. Derek hadn't left a note. No explanation. No threats. No ultimatums. Only absence. And that absence spoke volumes. At first Maya told herself it was temporary. He just needed space, maybe a day or two. But by the third evening, the truth settled in. He wasn't coming back. She checked her phone more than she cared to admit. No missed calls, no unread messages. It was as if she had become invisible in a life where she once held center stage. The neighbors began to notice. Derek, who used to wave from the driveway, who always mowed the lawn on Saturdays, was suddenly gone. Maya forced a smile when Mrs. Hargrove next door asked, "Everything all right, dear?" But her voice cracked with the lie. "Just a bit of work travel," she murmured. She couldn't bring herself to say the word separated. She didn't want it to be real. The woman she used to be, the one who meticulously planned her goals, who convinced herself she could manage everything, began to blur. She still went through the motions, dressing for class, making lists, logging into discussion forums, but the fire she used to fake for her studies had completely gone out. Her concentration frayed at the edges. She found herself rereading the same paragraph 10 times, never absorbing a word. It didn't take long for whispers to begin. Not from Derek. He never said a word publicly. But people saw things. The barista at the café had told someone who told someone else, and before long Maya was no longer the driven woman trying to better herself. She was the woman who cheated. the one who threw away a devoted husband for a man whose name she never dared say out loud anymore. Aiden, even that name now made her flinch. What once felt like escape now felt like a cage made of shame. He still texted her occasionally, "You okay?" or "Want to meet up?" but she rarely replied. The thrill, the illusion of support had evaporated. Aiden had always been a convenient distraction, a mirror reflecting the version of herself she wanted to believe in. But now, under the fluorescent lights of her mistakes, she saw him clearly. He had no anchor, no plan, he was never meant to be permanent. And worse, he wasn't even trying to be. Meanwhile, Derek was rebuilding in silence. He didn't speak about her to friends or colleagues, didn't share his pain in long posts or late-night rants, but those closest to him noticed the shift. He returned to work sharper than ever, more focused. He hit the gym again. He smiled more. Not often, but when he did, it reached his eyes in a way it hadn't for years. One day, his sister ran into Maya at the grocery store. No drama, no yelling, just a pointed glance and a single sentence. "He's better without you." It stung more than Maya expected, because, deep down, she knew it was true. The friends who had once rallied around her during her return to school were now hesitant. Conversations felt strained. People offered polite nods and little else. She realized, slowly and painfully, that Derek hadn't needed to say a word. The truth had a way of traveling without a mouthpiece. She had underestimated how visible betrayal could become when placed under the light of community. Maya tried to reclaim some sense of identity. She enrolled in a couple of new classes, convinced herself that she could still finish what she started, but even academia didn't offer the redemption she was hoping for. The grades remained stagnant. Her energy waned. No matter how many planners she filled or schedules she revised, nothing erased the quiet echo of a door that had once closed with love and now closed with finality. She told herself she would apologize again, maybe write a letter, maybe show up at his office. But every time she tried, the words felt small, empty, like they belonged to someone trying to rewrite a book that had already gone to print. And Derek? He didn't need closure. He had lived it the moment he watched her through the cafe window and chose not to make a scene. He had already mourned the marriage. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just done. As for Maya, she now understood what it truly meant to fail, not in school, but in life's most critical exam, the test of loyalty, the test of presence, the test of choosing the person who always chose you. And she had failed. 6 months had passed since Derek walked away, and by then the dust had long settled, but the silence that followed was louder than ever. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that lingers after an explosion, where everything has been scorched clean and left bare. Maya now lived in a small apartment on the east side of town. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom space with creaking floors and no view, but it matched her current life, functional, unadorned, and filled with echoes. She kept telling herself this was temporary, that she'd rebuild, that her independence was an opportunity, not a sentence. But the optimism faded quickly. The first few weeks alone were filled with frantic attempts to regain control. New routines, meditation apps, YouTube self-help playlists that promised healing in 7 steps. She tried journaling. She tried therapy. She even tried reaching out to friends she hadn't seen in years. But conversations inevitably circled back to Derek, or worse, Aiden. Aiden had vanished soon after the fallout. His texts grew shorter, more sporadic, until they stopped entirely. No goodbye, no closure. One day, she simply realized it had been weeks since his name appeared on her phone, and in a moment of brutal clarity she understood. She had been a detour for him, not a destination. He hadn't chosen her, he had entertained her. Derek, on the other hand, had chosen her every single day, until she gave him a reason not to. Derek didn't erase her from his life dramatically. There were no angry social media posts, no bitter rants to mutual friends. He simply disappeared from her orbit. His number stopped working, probably changed. His online profiles were either deleted or hidden. Mutual acquaintances respected his boundary and didn't mention him unless asked, and even then they kept it vague. All she ever heard was that he was doing well. That word stung more than she expected. Well meant, he wasn't just surviving. He was thriving. And he was. Derek had quietly moved to a new condo closer to the firm where he worked. The space was open, modern, and filled with warm light, very unlike the home he once shared with Maya. He started running again, taking long morning jogs through the park, the rhythm of his feet on pavement becoming its own form of therapy. He saw a therapist for a while, not because he was broken, but because he wanted to understand how he allowed himself to be lied to for so long. In time, Derek began dating again, not recklessly, but slowly, deliberately. He was no longer looking for someone to complete him. He had learned that the most dangerous kind of loneliness is the kind that exists inside a relationship. So now, he chose companionship with care. He never spoke ill of Maya. If her name came up, he simply said, "It didn't work out," and changed the subject. He had made peace with the past, not by forgetting it, but by refusing to let it dictate the future. Maya, on the other hand, found herself haunted by memories. They didn't hit her all at once, but in quiet moments. A pair of coffee mugs she forgot to return, a song on the radio they used to dance to in the kitchen, the way her hand still reached for the other side of the bed. These weren't just moments of nostalgia. They were reminders of what she had broken and what could never be put back together. In the end, the greatest punishment wasn't losing Derek's love. It was knowing she had once been trusted completely, and now she didn't even trust herself. The test she failed hadn't come with questions or essays. It had come with commitment, presence, and honesty. And in every way that mattered, she had answered wrong.